Hello and welcome to the Arc Woman podcast. This is an exploration of womankind. Here we discuss what it is to be a woman in the modern world while utilizing ancient and modern modalities in tandem to create a bounty of health for the body, mind and spirit. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Arc Woman podcast. Today we're talking about society's obsession with women being as small as they possibly can. Before we get into it, let's pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging on the lands of Litruwita, Tasmania, where I'm recording this podcast today. 2 Christmases ago, I was sitting at Christmas lunch with my family and a family who were visiting my home. The women had cooked about 75% of the meal and the men had stood at the barbecue meticulously flipping over pieces of meat that didn't really need any preparation. So they did help out a little bit and they did clean up the barbecue. I will say that. But the classic thing that happened after the meal was done is that I watched all of the women, myself, my sister, my mother, and the other woman of this family visiting, get up and immediately start cleaning because that's just what you do after a meal. There's a lot of cleaning to be done and they started to do that while the men, my father and the men of the other family, sat at the table. And I watched this and I think it was the first time I actually was cognizant of this happening. And I remember going, hey, what's going on? Are we your maids? What's going on here? Can we get a bit of help over here? Because we've done actually most of the cooking and now the women are doing the cleaning. So you guys got to get your ass into gear basically. And my dad was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. He didn't even notice. I think he was caught up in conversation. He was just like, I'm going to help. Straight in the kitchen, kicked my mum out. Amazing. Love you, Dad. So sweet. But what I noticed is that the men from the other family, just like it didn't click for them that I was talking to them, that I wasn't just talking to my dad, I was talking to all of them. And so I call back again. Hey, what are we, your maids? What's going on here? And so instead of them being like, oh, fuck, sorry, and getting up and cleaning, as adults do, they looked at my dad and my dad looked at them and they looked at my dad and my dad looked at them. And then they looked at each other, looked at him again and then scoffed, begrudgingly got up and slowly started to help. And that was, I think, it's really singed in my brain. And now once you notice who is expected to clean and who is expected to not clean, who is expected to be a maid, who is expected to be a guest, you really just can't unsee it. And you might think, okay, that's a really weird story to start this whole podcast about skinniness about, but it will connect because what this podcast is about is who gets to eat, who doesn't get to eat, who gets the prime cuts, who gets to relax, who gets to be skinny and who gets to be full, who takes up space and who doesn't. And you can guess which camp women very often fall into. There are a lot of cultural contagions that have gotten us to this modern age of our obsession with skinniness. And I really want to point out in this podcast that the obsession with smallness is not a modern day vanity problem. This is something that we have seen systematically implemented in every single culture for thousands of years, if not at the start of human evolution, basically. Who knows when this started? It's been around forever. What we're seeing today, the most frequent chapter of skinniness, is just our most recent iteration of understanding who gets to eat and take up space and who doesn't. This cultural obsession with thinness is actually a socially mediated way to control women. It's not driven by health research. It's not a neutral aesthetic preference. It's a pattern that is actually repeated with striking consistency every single time womankind have gained significant social and political power. The obsession with skinniness reappears in our cultural zeitgeist. And the mechanism underneath has basically stayed the same, but the language around the obsession with skinniness and smallness changes every single time. In fact, Virginia Woolf picked up on this in 1929 in her book, A Room of One's Own. She wrote, "One cannot think well, love well, sleep well if one has not dined well." She was writing in the same decade that she saw thinness becoming the ideal and how this was culturally being installed in Western women for the first time that she had seen it. And she saw the exact same thing that we are seeing now, literally 100 years later. So I want to start right at the beginning. Let's call this chapter 25,000 years ago, and let's talk about the Venus figures. The oldest known representation of the human body are actually carved figurines across Europe, from Pyrenees all the way to Siberia, huge amounts of land throughout Europe. They date approximately 25,000 BCE, and they are known collectively as the Venus figurines. You've probably seen these amazing figurines. The most famous of them is called the Venus of Willendorf. These small figurines, they fit in the palm of your hand. They were made to carry with you, and they depict women with large full breasts, rounded abdomens, wide hips, and generous thighs. Men carried them with them, and they made them with extraordinary care out of ivory, limestone, and clay. And they were understood to depict luck, abundance, and their partner waiting for them at home as they traveled. But what these figurines tells us is so much more than that. It tells us that for the vast majority of human existence, a well-nourished female body was considered sacred above all else and lucky. It was the physical representation of abundance, fertility, and the continuation of life. The body that modern culture has spent a century pathologizing as a problem requiring correction was for tens of thousands of years worth carving in stone and carrying close to you. This is the baseline. This is where humankind began, and I want you to hold that because that is in stark comparison to where we are now. Let's fast forward to ancient Greece, because in ancient Greece we actually have one of the first written ideas around differential eating and who gets to eat what and why. The first written records of girls being deliberately allocated less foods than boys came from Hellenistic Greece, and the numbers are really specific. Boys were allocated 16 ounces of food and girls were only allocated 12. Same age, right? Same developmental stage, I guess. Very different developmentally as well. Females and males develop differently. But women were systematically told that they needed to eat less, and thus they were 4 ounces less exactly. That's a 25% reduction in a girl's food allocation compared to boys. This was confided in household management texts. So this is what archaeologists found. They found these texts of how households organized food and who was allocated how much food, and they found again and again and again in this time period of Greece that girls were given 25% less food. And you might be thinking, well, I generally eat a little bit less than my partner anyway, but really, do you? I mean, generally you might feel a little bit less hungry, especially in your ovulation and your follicular phases. But I know I eat as much as my male partner does. And he's like 6'6", massive dude. Sometimes I'm eating more than him in my luteal and when I'm menstruating as well. And we have to keep in mind as well, this is ancient Greece. Birth control was not a thing. Girls were married off very, very young. The chances of girls from the age of 16 at least having one child already and be breastfeeding them, that's a huge nutritional need. It is a massive energetic need to breastfeed and also to grow human beings and birth them. And the fact that these women who were most probably breastfeeding, pregnant, birthing at a very, very young age and doing that throughout their life, because birth control did not exist and neither did consent, let's be very, very honest, they were still systematically given less food. So that one argument that I think a lot of people listening to this will say was like, well, I don't really eat as much as my guy and, you know, he's bigger than me. That's not necessary. That doesn't actually hold up to what was actually happening contextually in Hellenistic Greece. What I'm trying to highlight here is that this differential feeding was not actually representative of biological need. It was allocating who was important in the house via what food they got and how much food they got as well. So not only were girls most likely to eat less than men and allocated less food, but they also didn't get the prime cuts. You know, they were probably eating the foods that the men didn't want to eat. They were getting the leftovers pretty much. We also see this in medieval Paris as well. In Greece, we can see that girls are allocated less food overall, but in Paris, we can see what foods are being allocated less. And in this case, in medieval Paris, it is grain. Medieval Parisian grain records show girls being allocated approximately 2/3 of the grain allocated to boys within the exact same household. This 2/3 figure was not arrived at accidentally. It was reflected in a considered institutional position on the relative worth of female life and female labor. The pattern is consistent across documented households and institutional records of the period. 2/3. So not because girls ate less naturally. It's not because they worked less naturally. Housework is real work. These women worked like dogs. They really did in medieval Paris and medieval Europe generally. I hate this rhetoric that the trad wife people online have, is that women aren't made to work and like work was invented so the government could tax, you know, families twice because they could make more money out of this capitalistic agenda. That's not true. Women have always worked. It's just they've never been paid for it before. In the past 100 years, this is the first time women have been paid for their work. Women were still working in households, okay? They just didn't have any rights. And they were being fed less than men while also birthing and breastfeeding. In medieval Paris and generally medieval Europe, the amount of food you were allocated and what that food was reflective of your place in the social hierarchy of the household and also just generally the country you were living in. And this really communicates that most primal language available of who gets to eat, therefore is who is more important, right? So if you get the prime cuts and you get to eat first and you get to eat the most, you're the most important person in the household. Whereas if you are the least respected and you are on the lowest part of the social hierarchy, you're going to get the cuts that no one wants and you're going to eat the least. You might be thinking, okay, that's ancient Greece, that's medieval Paris, that was hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. How does that actually have any reflection in our modern society? We still see this today. We still see in modern households, women eat less, girls eat less, boys eat more, and men eat more, and they generally get better cuts as well. And we see this a lot in developing nations. Anthropological and public health studies across sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia consistently document boys receiving more protein, more calories, and more nutritionally dense food within the same household, while girls and mothers eat last and least. A national rapid assessment of avoidable blindness survey examined over 32,000 individuals and found blindness prevalence in 1.3% of women compared to 0.9% in men. So what I'm talking about here is corneal opacicy. So this is a condition that is directly caused by vitamin A deficiency. It's the most common cause of unilateral blindness in Nepalese children, and girls are disproportionately affected. So 30 to 40% more girls in Nepal will develop blindness that was absolutely avoidable because they get fed the least compared to the boys in the same household. How absolutely nuts is that? Vitamin A is present in liver, eggs, dairy, and orange and yellow vegetables. It is not exotic or expensive. What determines who receives it is not geography, it is priority. So what we have here, it's a really stark example that we have girls developing blindness in the same households where the boys aren't because they're being fed so differently. And this really highlights that medieval Paris grain artifact and what we're seeing in ancient Greece, these are not historical artifacts. This is a living document, right? This is a living document of how girls are systematically fed less and how this is negatively impacting their long-term health. Next, let's talk about this pattern. Once I explain this pattern to you, you're never not going to see it. Every single feminist wave that women have experienced in the last 100 years has been followed by an obsession with skinniness. Every single time. And look, the mechanism changes, the language changes, the culture changes, but it is the exact same fucking pattern every single time. And it's no surprise that we're seeing it now. As women gain political and economic ground, the culture will respond by installing an increasingly demanding standard of physical smallness. Naomi Wolf laid the groundwork of this argument in The Beauty Myth of 1991. Great book. One of the chapters talks about it. I think the chapter is called Hunger. Look, I know Naomi Wolf is a bit of a weird figure nowadays, but that book, The Beauty Myth, is absolutely incredible. I read that on the lead up to this podcast, and I highly recommend you read it. If you want to listen to it, I can put an Audible link down below. Let's talk about the 1990s feminist wave and how the suffragette movement led to the flapper skinniness ideal. And this is quite pertinent because this is literally 100 years ago. In 1920, women gained federal voting rights in the United States. Australia was significantly ahead of this curve, I have to say, with women gaining the vote in 1902, so 18 years before the United States. Go Australia. Within the exact same decade of women getting voting rights in the 1920s, the dominant female beauty ideal undergoes a complete reversal from the full-figured hourglass Edwardian ideal to flat-chested, narrow-hipped, boyish flapper silhouette. The corset was removed from fashion, and this really represented to women at the time of liberation. And I completely understand that. I don't even wear bras. I can't imagine how uncomfortable the corset was. But what this led to in fashion and culture was this almost rectangular, boyish figurine that was also super duper skinny. And women really wanted to fit within this ideal. to be a liberated woman was to be small. Around this time as well, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company published their first height and weight tables in the early 20th century. And this medicalized the concept of an ideal body weight for the first time. And this gave institutional authority to the idea that there was a scientifically correct size for a woman. And back then, you could imagine it was very small. We have to remember as well that in the 1920s, this is kind of where we're starting to see the idea of mass media starting to gain traction. And instead of women now comparing themselves to the women they knew around them, they were actually starting to compare themselves to women in magazines and women in film. And no surprises there, the ideal of women in media was to be very, very, very skinny and very, very small and boyish. So that's the first wave of feminism. Let's get to the second wave of feminism in the 1960s. This is also followed by an obsession with skinniness. So the second wave of feminism in the 1960s, actually, let me know if you want me to do a feminism podcast. I could probably focus on doing that. I digress. The second wave of feminism was about reproductive rights, workplace equality, and bodily autonomy. So feminism, but we want more rights. Okay, you've allowed us to vote, but we want more rights. We want to be paid equally. We want more bodily autonomy. We want access to birth control. We also want other things like maternity leave. And generally, just because you've given us the vote doesn't mean that necessarily things have changed. Women still were absolutely systematically oppressed. So as this is happening, of course, the obsession with skinniness ramps up with one of the most historically recognizable figures, Twiggy, also known as Leslie Lawson. She emerged as the defining model of 1966. She stood 5 foot 6 inches and reportedly at 91 pounds. She was nicknamed Twiggy because she was so thin that the joke in Britain at the time was that a waft of wind could break her in half. British Vogue apparently was really, really nervous about featuring her in the magazine, recognizing that something had shifted into new cultural territory. And the ideal in the 1960s wasn't necessarily like this boyishness that was quite small. It was like really almost frail, really slim, almost prepubescent, flat, narrow, stripped of hips and breasts, and the physical markers of adult womanhood were removed entirely and glorified. Second wave feminism was explicitly about the woman's body autonomy and reproductive rights, and the counter ideal erased the female body almost entirely. A body without hips or breasts is a body that cannot reproduce, it cannot be sexually threatening, and it cannot occupy maternal space, which in some ways, subconsciously, I think a lot of women would have felt safer. This obsession with prepubescent smallness and skinniness as a cultural response to adult women claiming autonomy over their reproduction is really, really difficult to read as a coincidence. It's very difficult to read, especially when it's the second time this has happened, especially when we have already the cultural foundation of feeding women less and that being systematically in place. Next is the third wave of feminism, which followed heroin chic in the 1990s. In the early 1990s, the obsession and I guess iteration of feminism here was the riot girl culture, bikini kill, Courtney Love, women being loudly and unapologetically political. The simultaneous dominant beauty image was heroin chic, so Kate Moss, the waif, extreme thinness paired with aesthetically fragility, pallor, and apparent illness. So now we've moved from, so first wave feminism was just small. Second wave of feminism was small, gaunt, and twig. And now third wave of feminism is small, gaunt, twig, prepubescent, and sick. How interesting is that? It's like a snowball of cultural skinniness that becomes more extreme every single time it iterates. Calvin Klein's advertising campaigns in the mid-1990s really centered on this aesthetic of gaunt, sick skinniness. And they were really eventually criticized by US President Bill Clinton for appearing to glamorize drug use and that so-called heroin chic. The beauty standard arrived dressed as anti-glamour and counterculture, so that riot girl punk era, but they were really subversive on the surface while delivering the same underlying message about female smallness. And again, this time it was even more extreme. And then we get to the fourth wave of feminism, which is arguable. I think a lot of people will argue about what wave of feminism occurred when and for who. And I think that's a whole other conversation. But for now, the fourth wave is what we're experiencing right now in the 20s, which is women being extremely educated, the 4B movement and the child-free by choice movement. women basically taking themselves back and not being male-centered anymore. And of course, this has been followed by Ozempic. What really ushered in this fourth wave of feminism was the Me Too movement, body positivity, intersectional analysis of feminism, which is why I say I'm an intersectional socialist feminist, and the most educated generation of women in recorded history. Now is the most educated group of women who have ever been on Earth ever before. And of course, the counterculture has not really liked that, has not really enjoyed that. Body positivity gained really huge, genuine cultural ground in the late 2010s, and the culture responds almost on cue. So, Roe versus Wade being overturned by the US Supreme Court in June 2012. So 12 years after the body positivity movement, Roe versus Wade is overturned and women don't have any access to reproductive rights. And the way this is occurring in the US at the moment, and the ricochet effects impacting other Western nations like Australia and the UK is also really concerning, especially for reproductive rights and access to safe termination specifically. But this followed the Me Too movement. This followed body positivity. So women pushing back and saying our bodies are beautiful no matter what. And also we want more reproductive rights. And also we're moving into the work sphere. Also we're a little bit more educated than you. Also we kind of don't want to date men. So naturally, counterculture pushed back against this and removed rights to safe abortion access for women. And I have to say, Roe versus Wade being overturned is the most significant single rollback of body autonomy in American history and Western history. And this occurred during the most academically and professionally powerful generation of women to ever exist. That is not a coincidence. At the same time, GLP-1 receptor agonists like Ozempic, Wegovy, and Mounjaro were approved for weight loss and rapidly become cultural status symbols, making pharmaceutical thinness available to those who can afford it. Extreme thinness ideal returns to red carpets and mainstream media, laundered through health and longevity science language that places it beyond feminist critique because it's biohacking, because it's about longevity, because of this rat study. That extreme thinness is accessible only to those who can afford it, though, which we'll be getting to. We're also seeing in the cultural zeitgeist skinny talk. We're also seeing like skinniness being pandered on Instagram as well. When I was growing up, there was a tiny little blip of skinniness obsession in the 2010s, which was very quickly put out by the Me Too movement and also by the body positivity movement, which was dope. But now it's a little bit unbridled. And, you know, all of that obsession was on Tumblr, by the way, when I was growing up. But now it's TikTok. Skinny talk is where it's at. There is no guardrails on TikTok at all to kind of put out any of this obsession with skinniness. And very often when we see that backlash online of people being like, you're too fat to go to Pilates, if you're over 120 pounds, I don't want to see any attitude, you should put that attitude on the treadmill. These are things that are really literally happened in the last 2 weeks. This is what people are saying online now. People saying that they would rather be skinny than save the world. It's just really unbridled and really, really extreme. I remember when skinniness was an extreme and the glamorization of anorexia on Tumblr growing up, but this is on a different level. This is on a complete different level. It's really, really extreme on TikTok specifically. Basically, by now, I want you to understand that the obsession with skinniness is not something new. It is a social backlash contagion. It is a weapon to keep women under control that's activated literally every single time they move up in the world collectively. It basically upgrades its operating system every single time women find a way to critique the previous version. So in the 1920s, it was modernity. In the 1960s, it was avant-garde fashion. In the 1990s, it was subversion. And in the 20s, it's personalized medicine. So the language changes every single time, but it's the same thing every single time. And I would even argue, as I said before, it just gets worse every single time. It becomes even more extreme every single time. Okay, so all of that talk about the social contagion obsession with skinniness, you understand now it is not something that women have come to on their own. It is a social contagion. Women have been brainwashed. It is a control mechanism. We get that. So let's actually talk about what body fat is. So I think it's really interesting because fat on a woman's body is really essential. I would even kind of call it an organ because it is acting as an endocrine organ of sorts. And in this section, I just want to talk about what is biologically happening when women reduce their body fat percentage too far. In its essence, body fat, also known as adipose tissue, is a secondary sex characteristic. So your primary sexual characteristics are things like your mammary glands and the development of your period and you getting your period. Okay, those are primary sex characteristics. Secondary ones are an increase in bodily fat and, drumroll, cellulite. I think a lot of women don't understand that cellulite is a part of your secondary sexual characteristic. It is how we can tell that someone has moved through puberty. It is completely normal and natural. Higher body fat percentage is a secondary sex characteristic in women. It is the same biological characteristic as breast development, hip widening, and the hormonal changes of puberty. Basically, female body fat is not incidental biology. It has to happen if you are developing as a woman. It is the body doing exactly what it was designed to do at reproductive maturity. It is 100% normal. The characteristic distribution of fat on a female body, hips, thighs, bum, breasts, all the things that make us such juicy, juicy human beings, is determined by the architecture of estrogen receptor expression in adipose tissue. So we have receptors for estrogen in adipose tissue. When estrogen starts to circulate, because we start to cycle, we start to gain fat in those areas. Completely normal sexual characteristic. And alongside that, we also see cellulite. So cellulite is present in 80 to 90% of post-pubertal women. I have cellulite on my hips and it's completely normal. It's structurally determined by the architecture of female connective tissue. The fibrous septae in women run perpendicular to the skin surface compared to crisscross patterns in men, which is why the same fat distribution looks different through the female versus the male skin. Cellulite is not caused by being overweight. It is present in women of all body sizes, and it is a primary function of female connective tissue biology. It is a secondary sexual characteristic. It is developed at puberty. It is not a defect. It is a feature of the female body that has properly matured. So anyone online telling you that cellulite is not normal, that you need to get rid of cellulite, that I used to have cellulite, but I use this product and now it's gone, it's completely fine. It's your body. You can do whatever you like. If you don't like your cellulite and you want to do something about it, go for it, babe. But just so you know, it is a normal artifact of being a woman. As I said before, adipose tissue, fat on your body, is an endocrine organ. Adipose tissue is a primary site of estrogen synthesis and storage in women, particularly the post-reproductive years when your ovaries reduce its output, so post-menopause. Peripheral conversion of androgens to estrogen via the enzyme aromatase also occurs primarily in your fat tissue as well. What that basically means is your fat is making hormones. It is an endocrine organ. When body fat drops below a threshold the body requires in a female body, the downstream hormonal consequences are really, really, really significant. So estrogen production decreases, and that disrupts ovulation and your menstrual cycle if you are still ovulating. Fertility is compromised because you're not ovulating anymore, so the HPO axis isn't really switched on anymore. It's almost on pause. And that means you have less dopamine and serotonin because estrogen upregulates both of those hormones in your body, and they're associated with drive and happiness and basically vivaciousness and zest. Bone mineral density decreases as well because estrogen increases bone density. That's why when you are in your cycling years, lifting weights and eating a lot of calcium alongside your naturally occurring estrogen is one of the most important things you can do, because this is the time where we're forming our bone mass. So less estrogen equals less bone mass equals you're more likely to fall over and break your hip when you're 80 years old. Alongside lower dopamine and serotonin, we're also seeing lower melatonin, because serotonin is the precursor to melatonin. So that's why women who are really, really, really skinny, don't have any motivation, feel really, really tired during the day and they can't sleep at night, it's because melatonin really depends on fat from your body. Okay, so fat is good. All of that is great. Cool. I understand that. Let's actually talk about the caloric needs, your energy intake needs in comparison to men. I think a lot of women just assume that because their bodies are significantly smaller than men's in some cases. I mean, again, as I said before, my partner is over 6 foot tall. He's massive. It doesn't necessarily mean that our energetic needs are hugely different, especially as adults. A moderately active woman's caloric needs, when adjusted for body weight and body size, are only 250 calories less a day than a man's equivalent size and activity. And that gap closes entirely and actually reverses during pregnancy. So women need an additional 500 calories per day, and lactation, which is actually one of the most metabolically demanding processes a woman will ever go through. Some would even argue it's more metabolically demanding than when you are pregnant. What I'm really trying to pin down here is that women biologically do not need to eat less than men. And if so, it's only a tiny bit less. In a world without contraception, in the world in which most of this cultural programming was installed, women were eating for a significant proportion of their entire lives, and they were eating less than men. Giving women less food was never about biological need. It was always about what they were permitted to have. Everyone has a kitchen table or a place where you eat most of your meals, but we don't really think of it as a political site. But I'm going to make an argument that it very much is. Food prepared at home has for most of history been the primary language of love, safety, and belonging. To feed someone well was to take care of them. Abundance at the table meant the family was protected. The act of cooking and the act of nourishment were inseparable. And in fact, one of the ways that archaeologists can timestamp when a society became more of an organized civilization was not from buildings, it wasn't from what they were making, it was actually the ability to see a femur bone that had broken and had healed. Because what that represented was that a femur being broken, which is catastrophic, really, and if you don't live in an organized society, that person will just be left for dead. But the fact that they see femur bones in societies that have healed means that someone was taking care of them and feeding them. That is the original marker of an organized civilization. This relationship with food as love, as sustenance, as community is still a dominant one in many non-Western cultures and in working class communities globally. The Sunday roast, the feast after the funeral, the food as a medium through which care is expressed and relationships are held together. In Australia, it's, do you want to come over for a cuppa? Love that. So food being this representation of a culture that is organized and caring, a household that is nourishing and loving, has now deviated quite significantly. Something really negative has happened to our relationship with food within the modern Western context. Food has stopped being primarily about nourishment and has become primarily about identity signaling, and the signal has been flipped. So for most of human history, abundance at the table signaled wealth, the full table, the generous host, and the well-fed body as an evidence of prosperity. So the Venus of Willendorf in here as a great example. The Industrial Revolution made calories accessible for the working class for the first time, and fatness, bigness, taking up lots of room, really lost its status signal when people across economic strata could carry it. The wealthy class began differentiating itself through restraint, and thinness became a marker of self-discipline, refinement, and class. This inversion was underway by the late 19th century and accelerated sharply throughout the 20th. In this year of 2026, this inversion is absolutely complete. You cannot argue with that point, and it's also pharmacologically enforced. The affluent can afford to be hungry. They can afford to not have a cognitive load of restriction. They can afford the GLP-1 prescriptions, the Pilates memberships, the organic groceries, the meal prep time, and the time to research what new diet to basically take on so they can become smaller and smaller because they can afford to. The working class, though, and the people living close to the poverty line, right? So the poor now have access to calorically dense food that is rarely nutritionally packed. And so now we see the social contagion. We see someone who's small, we associate that with wealth, and we see someone who is overweight, and we see that person as undisciplined. And it's really sad because the person living in a food desert where the only food accessible to them financially is quite calorically dense, that person is now seen as really undisciplined and has no control over their life. Whereas the person who has control and is disciplined also has the time and the wealth in order to do so. Next, I want to talk about the labor invisibility around meals and food. The Christmas story I told you at the beginning is not about rudeness. It is about a hierarchy at the dinner table that is so naturally, inevitably ingrained in our societal structure of food that it's become invisible. So not only to the men at the table, but arguably to the women who also internalize it and keep this going. The structural reality of women's relationship with food in communal eating and settings is rarely named directly. So number one, women cook the meal, having grazed throughout the entire preparation rather than sitting down to a full undivided plate. Secondly, often will serve others before themselves as a default. This is not necessarily a desirable choice, but this is actually an expectation in most households where women are doing most of the domestic duties. Number three, women will generally eat while managing children, elderly relative, and household logistics simultaneously. I think a lot of us last year, there was this movement online where mothers were sitting at the table with all of their kids and the father was eating his meal. We saw that a lot, and that's starting to resurface now. And I guess the resurfacing that we're seeing now that I've actually pointed out online is that idea that a woman is sitting there having her first plate as she's kind of feeding her baby and her partner, her male partner, is on their third bowl of food and she's looking at this amazing food that she spent hours making disappearing because she hoped that this would be tomorrow's lunch, maybe tomorrow's dinner as well, and she would have less labor. But he's eating all of her hard work while she's also feeding someone else and not having enough time to feed herself, basically. So the labor also occurs while she's sitting down to eat her meal. And what I'm pointing out there in that last point as well is that women will often not eat in an undistracted way. They will be interrupted, distracted. They will be standing up for far more time than men do during meal times as well. And alongside that, women eat last. Look at it. Next time you're at a family dinner, look who sits down last. It's not the men. By the time they sit, the best food is gone and the expectation to clear is already forming. So when women are visiting someone else's home, a woman is culturally expected to help prepare and clean up. She arrives as a latent staff or as a maid in that household, whereas a man arrives as a guest. He is there expecting to be fed, served, and relieved of all domestic responsibilities. This structural reality produces under-eating without requiring any beauty ideal at all. The thinness ideology then arrives on top of this already established pattern and calls it a virtue. So smallness is a virtue. She's so giving, she's happy to be interrupted. She's happy to feed everyone else. She's happy to be the last one down. She's happy to feed everyone else first. She's happy to eat the cuts that aren't necessarily hers. Like, this is all idealized, this is what it is to be a woman. And I think the thing here as well is that as women growing up, I don't think we realize that our mum will teach us things throughout our life about our relationship with food that isn't necessarily told to us with words, but we see it. We see her eating up and eating. We see her feeding everyone else first. These are things that we generally pick up, that women deserve less. And you learn whose appetite matters by watching whose plate gets filled up first, basically. And it's never mum's. Let's move on to our next section called the numbers. I want to talk about the 1,200 calorie myth going around the internet. I'm not really happy with it. And I'm going to be comparing it to wartime starvation. Yes. 1,200 calories a day is currently one of the most widely circulated dietary targets for women in Western diet culture. It's popularized really harshly on Skinny Talk, so TikTok, Instagram, and throughout diet programs. Kayla Itzanis, I'm looking at you. The UN Food Program defines chronic hunger as consuming fewer than 2,100 calories a day. 900 calories difference between what the UN Food Health Program says is starvation. That's what women are currently eating right now, is 900 calories less than that. The FAO sets the average minimum daily requirement for an adult at approximately 2,000 calories. 1,200 calories is below the WHO definition of chronic hunger by 900 calories. Okay, we should be very upset by this. Let's compare this also to something called the Dutch hunger winter. So if you didn't know, the Dutch hunger winter, the hunger winter, was a famine in the Nazi-occupied Netherlands that ran from November 1944 to May 1945. It was classified as one of the most significant humanitarian catastrophes of 20th century Europe. I was a nanny in the Netherlands, and I remember in my first week of being there peeling potatoes. And I'm an Australian lass. I grew up in a world of abundance. I'm so lucky. And I was peeling these potatoes with a knife, and the grandmother of the family slapped the knife out of my hand and said, you're not leaving enough potato on there. I grew up with parents who lived through the hunger winter. And if we did this, we wouldn't be able to eat dinner because this is you're wasting food. And that is just how intense this impacted people in the Netherlands. It put so much fear into this woman that she couldn't watch me waste food because it was so ingrained in her that her parents almost starved and died during Nazi-occupied Netherlands in 1945. Before the famine during normal wartime occupation, the Dutch adult ration was 1,600 calories a day. This was the Nazi-imposed wartime survival ration. This is what a military occupying force calculated as the minimum to keep a civilization population functioning. And functioning, right? Not thriving. This is a mechanism that militaries use when they occupy other countries to stop those citizens from revolting against them because they simply don't have energy to do so. By mid-November of 1944, the official ration was dropped below 1,000 calories a day. By April 1945, the ration was as low as 370 to 500 calories a day, consisting of little more than bread and potatoes. People ate grass and tulip bulbs in order to survive. 22,000 people died and 4.5 million people were affected for the rest of their lives. The hunger winter of the Netherlands is really famous in epigenetics because of the biological trauma of starvation being passed forward through generations. Children born to mothers who were pregnant during the famine showed elevated rates of obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and schizophrenia in adulthood. This was the body's adaptation to perceived scarcity, and this is heritable. Again, what I'm trying to highlight here is the obsession with the 1,200 calorie diet is currently circulating on social media, and wellness goals sits between pre-famine Nazi occupation rations and the documented famine that people in the Netherlands experienced in 1945. This is not a health target. 1,200 calories is not enough food, okay? This is voluntarily recreating the nutritional conditions of a humanitarian crisis and then calling it a lifestyle. It is absolutely outrageous. Next, let's talk about the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. In 1944, so the exact same year that the Dutch people were experiencing hunger winter, psychologist Ansel Keys at the University of Minnesota conducted a landmark study on what caloric restriction actually does to a human being. His subjects were 36 healthy, psychologically stable men who volunteered for the study as an alternative to military service. So Keys restricted these men to approximately 1,500 calories a day for 6 months, figure higher than the 1,200 calorie target widely promoted for women today. The results are absolutely catastrophic. So the men became obsessed with food. They started to dream about it constantly. They were reading cookbooks all the time, collecting recipes, and they talked about nothing else but food. They were depressed, they were anxious, and they were emotionally dysregulated. They also were socially withdrawing, and they were really irritable, and they were more anxious, and this all increased quite significantly. Several men experienced complete psychological breakdowns, cognitive function declined measurably, and libido just disappeared in all of the men as well. The same caloric and psychological profile that the Minnesota study classified as a crisis in healthy men is the daily lived reality of millions of women who are told they are doing something healthy by eating 1,200 calories a day. Then let's compare the 1,200 calorie diet myth to global poverty levels. In low-income countries, average daily caloric intake sits at approximately 1,980 calories, and this is an average, so meaning the poorest within those countries fall well below this as well. So the poorest 10% of the population in the majority of countries in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa subsist primarily on staple foods with extremely limited access to nutrient-dense foods. A woman in rural Chad or Bangladesh consuming 1,400 to 1,600 calories a day is classified by international humanitarian organizations as chronically undernourished, and aid organizations mobilize resources to address their situation. So a woman in Melbourne consuming 1,200 calories a day may be praised online and sold products to help her stay there and told that she's taking care of herself, but she's actually eating far less than women on the poverty line in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. I touched on this before around the purity and the cleanness associated with eating less and skinniness as a whole. I want to talk about the language around food, because I think if you start to listen carefully to how we talk about food, you'll notice that we have never stopped talking about food in moral terms. So clean, pure, guilt-free, sinful, indulgent, cheat day, good choices, bad choices. A woman who eats little and carefully is disciplined, intentional, and healthy. And a woman who eats freely is letting herself go. The grammar of food is the grammar of religion, transgression, atonement, virtue, and grace. And we have a really, really, really deep history of female fasting seen as a virtue. The anthropologist Mary Douglas argued in Purity and Danger of 1966, during that second wave of feminism, that cultures mark the boundaries of social bodies through ideas of contamination and cleanness, and that women's bodies have historically been the primary site onto which those anxieties are projected. The menstruating body, the pregnant body, the eating body, the aging body. All have been culturally coded as requiring management, containment, and purification throughout recorded history. To be a woman is to be dirty and to be wrong. Medieval Christian theology specifically celebrated female fasting as a form of spiritual advancement. So Catherine of Siena, Columbia Orati, and other female saints were celebrated for consuming almost nothing, with their food restriction being read as evidence of holy transcendence. And it's really weird actually, because I see this idea and rhetoric being circulated in fasting and breatharian communities. So people who are eating like raw vegan diets will very often move into fasting and breatharian cultures, and they will often talk about how pure and clean they feel when they don't eat. The thin, fasting female body was the body that is closest to God. The well-nourished female body was the body that belonged too much to the earth and therefore was dirty and wrong. And so we can see this in different eras of skinniness. So I spoke about Tumblr era of skinniness, so 2010 to 2015. The Tumblr era of diet culture was the period which restriction became a really full aesthetic. We had never seen it become like thinness become an obsession ideal online before, but it definitely was very pertinent on Tumblr. If you're on Tumblr in 2010 to 2015, which I loved Tumblr. Finspo and Menspo content framed starvation as aspirational. So that quote that Kate Moss said years ago that she now regrets that nothing tastes as good as skinny feels was really circulating a lot on Tumblr during that time. And that really coded hunger as moral superiority. So if I was hungry, I was morally superior to someone who fed themselves. Thinness during the Tumblr era was also aesthetically linked to fragility, melancholy, and sensitivity. To be visibly thin was to signal that you were deep, complex, and above the crude business of eating. Then we move forward to the 2020s, where we're actually seeing that obsession with skinniness, and the Tumblr inspo period of time is now the clean girl aesthetic. The language has shifted from less to pure, and the architecture has not changed at all. So the clean girl aesthetic combines minimal makeup, specific foods like green juice, raw vegetables, whole foods, nothing processed, branded wellness objects like specific water bottles, supplements, and clean glass skincare, and lean bodies that perform health rather than restrictions. So it's sold to you as something that's really, really, really healthy. And the genius of the clean girl aesthetic rebrand from Thinspo is that it really has just absorbed that body positivity critique entirely. So you can't accuse clean eating of being disordered because it presents itself as nourishment. It's not necessarily about eating less as it was in Tumblr eras. It's about eating right. The effect on many women is functionally identical to restriction. So an exhausting moral relationship with food, constant self-monitoring, and a hierarchy in which some bodies and some eating behaviors are coded as elevated and others as contaminated. So where the obsession with skinniness in the 90s and the 2010s was about just eating less and being less, the 2020s are very, very different. And it's more about eating specifically right and almost this behavior of orthorexia. Orthorexia nervosa is a clinical condition characterized by an obsessive preoccupation with eating the correct or pure foods, typically without significant caloric restriction, but with severe psychological distress and life impairment around your food choices. It is a condition that's most accurately produced by clean eating culture and the least discussed or treated from psychologists because its presentation is really indistinguishable from someone who's just taking really good care of their body. Unlike anorexia and bulimia, orthorexia is not formally classified underneath the DSM-5 as a standalone diagnosis, which has limited research funding and clinical recognition, despite significant prevalence and evidence. And research also suggests that orthorexic patterns are also more prevalent among health professionals, fitness communities, and wellness-oriented populations, precisely the audiences that clean eating culture targets. And it's really pervasive because there are so many different groups that present in different ways. You could be the paleo camp. You could be like the Paul Saladino, I'm not eating my lentils camp. Fear around food generally is one of the mainstays of orthorexia and generally thinking about food a lot. I've been circling around skinny talk a little bit more, and I want to go deeper into what we've just spoken about and start talking about class as well. So let's talk about what skinny talk actually is. So skinny talk is a TikTok subculture that emerged visibly around 2024, explicitly celebrating extreme thinness, thigh gaps, and very low body weight as absolutely aspirational. What distinguishes it from previous waves is its shamelessness. It arrived after body positivity has its cultural movement, and it rejects it openly. It's not apologizing for what it is. Content typically involves what I eat in a day videos at very low caloric intake, body checks, aesthetic documentation of thinness, and increasingly the normalization of GLP-1 drug use as a lifestyle choice rather than a medication intervention. And the thing about skinny talk that I really have to point out is that it is outrageous and funny. Very often I've seen quite a lot of videos that are very concerning to me that I've laughed at. It's a woman opening up her fridge with Tate McRae playing in the background, and the caption is something like, wait till you see me in summer, you little bitches, and it's lots of Greek yogurt. The whole fridge is just Greek yogurt and Monjaro. It's outrageous. Like your only response to that video that is made to be funny is also you just can't really critique it in a way because you've just laughed at it in a way, if that makes any sense. It's women online saying that I don't want to see you have any attitude if you're over 160 pounds. If you're 120 pounds, that's fine. It's women online saying that if you're fat, you shouldn't be going to Pilates. If I walk into a Pilates studio and I see my instructor doesn't look skinny, then I'm leaving because she's not a Pilates instructor. Like, these things that generally used to be outrageous and quite mean now are being seen as funny and outrageous and clickbaity in a way. Research on TikTok's recommendation algorithm has also shown that engaging with diet or body content creates a radicalization pipeline, pushing users towards increasingly thin content operating identically to how political extremist content spreads on the platform. So if women engage with someone saying, this is what I'm eating in a day, and she likes that post, the next thing she might see is another what I eat in a day, but it's a woman eating less. And then it might be an outrageous funny video on someone taking Ozempic. And then it might be tradwife content. And it takes you on this pipeline that eventually ends in this area of the world where it's telling you to be small and basically to give up a lot of your rights. And that's something that I've seen online as well. The rise of tradwife content has also been the rise of skinniness content as well. They are absolutely interconnected and they depend on each other. Let's talk about the gloss and the class signal of skinniness too. What Skinny Talk and its aesthetic cousins, the clean girl, that girl, glazed donut aesthetic, all share is extraordinary visual productions. These are not raw, honest documentations of restriction. They are aspirational lifestyle content with high production values, expensive apartments, specific color palettes like white, walnut, and sage green. I see a lot, and a very particular set of consumer objects. The branded stainless steel water bottle, the Air One smoothie at $22, the Reformer Pilates membership, the $38 moisturizer, the organic grocery haul from Air One, the GLP-1 prescription at several $100s a month. The thin, small body is embedded in an entire class aesthetic. You cannot extract one from another. What is being sold is not a body shape, it is a class position. The Skinny Talk body requires not just money, but time. Time to exercise, time to meal prep, time to shop at the farmers markets and take photos of yourself at the farmers markets. It's time to make a iced matcha latte in the morning, to cook from scratch. Time is the resource most unavailable to women working multiple jobs and raising children alone. A green juice in most Australian cities costs more than a full meal at a fast food restaurant. The clean girl aesthetic is aspirational in the same way a luxury handbag is aspirational. Except like a handbag, you cannot save up for it if your cortisol is chronically elevated and you're eating from a petrol station at 10 p.m. after your second shift with your kids waiting at home. The interesting thing about Skinny Talk and this wave of skinniness as well is that it has absorbed the body positivity movement. Therefore, this iteration of skinniness is really, really hard to critique. The body positivity movement did not originate in Western mainstream wellness culture. It emerged from fat liberation activism, primarily from Black women and queer communities in the United States from the late 1960s and onwards. The National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance was founded in 1969. The movement was explicitly political, connected to civil rights, and centered the most marginalized bodies. By the 2010s, the body positivity movement had been absorbed by the same beauty and wellness industry it was critiquing. It was rebranded as self-love while simultaneously selling products premised on body dissatisfaction. So basically, brands absorbed the language of body positivity, but they didn't want to give up the money that they were making from women feeling horrible about their body. So we're going to give you a gua sha, but it's told to you that it's self-care, but you're still being sold this idea that your face isn't good enough. Your green juice is being sold to you as self-care, but it's also subliminally telling you that if you drink this, maybe you'll be skinny. If you're picking up what I mean, they were absorbing all the ideals of the body positivity movement that Black women, Black queer women in America started to found in the 1960s, that second wave of feminism. It's absorbed it. And now we're seeing the clean girl era basically born out of it. We can't talk about the ideal of thinness and smallness without also talking about race. I am an intersectional feminist after all. The thin ideal is specifically a white Western beauty standard, and this must be named very, very clearly. So, Black, Indigenous, and many non Westernized cultural traditions have historically celebrated fuller bodies and associated them with health, fertility, beauty, and desirability. Research has consistently shown that Black women report higher body satisfaction at higher body weights than white women, a meaningful resistance to the dominant standard. The globalization of the white thin body ideal through digital media is actively eroding this, with researchers documenting increases in disordered eating patterns in communities that previously had really strong cultural protection against them. The imposition of white thinness as the universal standard is a colonial project layered on top of a patriarchal one. So this is the foundation. Now I want to zoom out and talk about what's actually happening right now in 2026. For the first time in recorded history, women are outpacing men academically at every single level in every single Western nation. Women now earn the majority of bachelor's programs and master's degrees in Australia, the United States, United Kingdom, and across most of the world's developed countries. Women are approaching parity and majority in doctoral programs in multiple fields. We have already crossed that threshold. So more PhDs and more doctorates are being handed to women than we've ever seen before in history. Alongside this, and because of this, women are delaying marriage at historic rates, choosing to remain child-free at historic rates, and entering professional fields that were male-dominated within living memory. And so I just want to point out this is not incremental progress. We are seeing an absolute leap in education, an absolute leap in women entering the workforce and outpacing men within it as well. This is a structural civilizational shift in the relationship between men and women and institutional power. It's happening right now. We can see it happening. And as we're seeing this happening, of course, as we're seeing this happening, we're also seeing the simultaneous degradation of women's rights. Roe versus Wade being overturned, removing the constitutional right to an abortion that had existed since 1973. Right-wing political movements are globally moving and surging with a consistent agenda item: the restoration of traditional gender roles, the reframing of female ambition as selfishness, and the reassertion of state control over reproductive capacity. The manosphere, the tradwife aesthetic, the broader tradwife movement are mainstream enough to generate billions of views and dollars and influence election outcomes. And oh my goodness, does thinness make a lot of money? There is a huge financial architecture to the perpetual dissatisfaction that women feel with their bodies. And it's absolutely no coincidence that it is happening at a time where women have never been more academically and professionally abundant. The global weight loss and diet management industry is valued at over 200 billion USD in recent years, and it's continuing to grow. The business model of the diet industry requires perpetual dissatisfaction. A customer who achieves their goal and is at peace with their body is a customer who stops spending money. The industry, therefore, is structurally incentivized to ensure the goal remains always slightly out of reach, that new products are always necessary, and that the standard is always revised upward. And what's really interesting about at least this wave of feminism and what we're experiencing now is we're seeing this obsession with skinniness also at the time where we're seeing an obesity epidemic. And I don't think I can talk about one without the other, because I don't think this obsession with skinniness would have really occurred to this extreme level if we didn't have an obesity epidemic. I think they really play into one another. The obsession with extreme thinness has arrived at the exact same historical moment as the highest global obesity rates in recorded history. And you might think this is a contradiction, and it's really not. What this really is showing is that the same phenomenon is viewed from different economic positions. The global obesity epidemic is driven primarily by ultra-processed food, cheap, engineered, hyper-palatable, and disproportionately consumed by people under economic stress with limited time and food access. It is a poverty epidemic expressed through the body and misread as personal failures of discipline. The bodies most likely to carry more weight in 2026 are bodies under chronic stress with elevated cortisol, poor sleep, high inflammatory loads, and limited access to nutritionally dense food and time to exercise and prepare healthy food at home. And these are all downstream consequences of economic precariousness. The same bodies that have been culturally coded as undisciplined, unhealthy, and morally deficit, the material conditions that produce the body are rendered invisible. The body is read as its own cause. Meanwhile, as this is happening, and we're saying that fat people are morally defect, so they don't have morals, you can't trust them around food, they have no control. We're seeing this rise of GLP-1 medications being prescribed to the affluent as a lifestyle intervention. This produces the thin body as a purchasable class signal for the first time in history. Now, for the first time in history, we're seeing a two-tier biological reality that have been flipped. So the working class and economically precarious women's bodies are expanding because of the food environment that poverty creates, and wealthy women's bodies are constricting through pharmaceutical and lifestyle interventions. And the cultural gaze lands on both as a moral failure. You cannot win because one woman's body is seen as too large and therefore as a deficit of morals and control, and the other for not being small enough yet. The obsession with thinness and smallness is not happening despite the obesity epidemic. It is happening because of it. It is a class signal in a moment when the visual distinction between economic positions has never mattered more. We've come to the end of this huge podcast. I hope you have a lot to think about. I would like to know what you thought about this podcast and what you think I missed. To end today, I want to ask you a question. Who do you think benefits when women are too small and weak to defend themselves? Who benefits when women aren't strong and properly nourished? I hope you have a lot to reflect on today, and hopefully you can walk away from this podcast with a little bit more pep in your step to know that being fully fueled, bigger, and abundant is perfectly okay and could even be a way to push back against the patriarchy as a whole. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to listen to this episode. If you loved it, please remember to like, subscribe, and send to a loved one. If you want to learn more from ARC Woman, please check out the website at arcwoman.com.au, where you can find a plethora of offerings like charts, masterclasses, courses, and organic clothing. You can also head over to patreon.com/arcwoman or substack.com/arcwoman to join the community. I hope you have a really beautiful morning, afternoon, or evening wherever you are in the world, and I will see you on the next episode.